All right, clean freaks, welcome back to this session of Lost in Space. And we've got a very interesting session here today. This one is a bit of a human interest, plus, process efficiency, plus kind of story role application, and a little bit of, I don't know, John, crazy about instruments, I don't know what the word is maybe for that. But this is John Rowe, and we're going to be talking about his journey and his mission to do away with missing instruments in the facilities that he's worked in his sterile processing career. So, yeah, John, welcome to this session today. We're glad you could be with us.
Thanks, Hank. Thanks for having me. I really have been looking forward to having a chance to sit down and speak with you.
It's been a couple of years. Anyone who has listened to the Beyond Clean podcast through the years has probably heard me a number of times reference John Rowe and reference stories about instrument coordination and such, but they've always been little comments here and there. This session, we finally get an opportunity, John, to kind of bring you in, tell the whole story, the good and the bad, the challenges, and the opportunities, the successes, and the failures, and really outline it so folks can hopefully not have to learn the hard way when it comes to many of these missing instrument projects. And hopefully out of this conference, a lot of folks will be like, okay, I'm inspired, I'm encouraged, I got some tools now, I'm going to go tackle the universe out there. So that's the goal. But before we get into all those specifics, I want to talk about the man who is on this mission, John Rowe. So start us kind of back how you got into sterile processing in the first place, and then we'll go from there.
Wow. So you're reaching back about 16 years at this point. So it's been a long journey, but I was looking for something to do in the health career as aspect of the workforce in the industry. I wanted to help people, and honestly, back then I was coming from a retail background. So jumping in, I've always viewed my career path as something of a mixture of customer service and inventory management, even from the retail days, even up to now. So I had the opportunity to start back at what was then called Baptist Hospital East as a frontline sterile processing technician, and was completely overwhelmed right out of the gate with everything that I had just gotten myself into and everything I had to learn, and just learning this whole new world that I didn't know existed.
Yeah. So you say you didn't know the world existed. So how did you land on sterile processing in particular? Because, obviously healthcare is quite broad. There's a lot of roles in hospitals you could apply to. So why SPD? What led you there?
So it was interesting. At the time, the hospital was expanding their services. They'd actually developed a new outpatient OR, and they were just looking for, people to work. And I hit apply all back when I applied at Baptist, and then I had a very fortunate time to get selected for this.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, it was pure happenstance, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of a lot of stories you hear from folks. There is a growing percentage of folks who are like, they know they want to do SPD when they're graduating high school, right? Even there's some high school training programs. Actually, there's one down in San Antonio there that you can begin your training before you even graduate as a high school senior. Kind of crazy. But then there's all the rest of us who is like, well, we didn't necessarily have this plan, but the plan found us, and then we ended up saying, hey, this is awesome. This is amazing. I can dedicate my life to this. So because this is a conference on missing instruments, obviously we need to talk about that piece. And I'm taking you back 16 years now, John, right? But my question here is, what is your earliest memory of missing instruments in your sterile processing experience?
Ooh, the very first instrument of the very first tray I ever remember, it was a lap Coley set, and the first instrument on the count sheet was towel clips. And that was the first thing I remember not being able to find out of everything that was in front of me. Just dumped out full tray of instruments. Where are the towel clips? Where are the towel clips? And that was definitely a recurring theme in the early days.
I was going to say, yeah, that might have been the first instrument, but for some reason, those towel clamps are probably still missing 16 years later. So, as a new tech, in those early days, when you confronted missing instruments, what went through your mind? Did you have an idea of the cause or the implication? Did you realize the real scope of this challenge?
So that's a very interesting thing to think about. But no, I didn't. I just knew it wasn't in front of me, and I didn't know what happened to it. And I think that speaks to that opportunity where it's important to educate the newer staff and even older staff about instrument usage and what could be going on with these instruments and why they're disappearing. So towel clips, for example, get tossed out with drapes, unfortunately. But, not understanding that at the time, I was just like, where is it? And I would go hunt in all the wrong places trying to find this, missing instrument.
Right. I think we're going to talk about all those wrong places here a little bit later in the interview. But, if at the beginning, I think you're right. Most techs, when I look back, I'm about 15 years ago now that I was in the industry. And it's the same way. I remember having missing instruments, but it was more of like an irritation and a frustration for me. Nothing really process oriented besides, this is going to slow me down. Like, here I go, like you said, I'm going to go on the hunt. But it wasn't until a couple of years later where the true weight of this actually hits me. So I guess my follow-up to you is, do you remember, if not the first time, but, that kind of season in your career where you started realizing, oh, this missing instrument thing is a big deal. It's not just a frustration.
Absolutely. I remember having a conversation with the OR and needed a specific instrument in the set and it wasn't there. And just realizing the gravity, the importance there of needing that instrument and it wasn't available, how it impacted patient care was a huge piece. And I think that's another piece where we're disconnected in the sterile processing world from the OR and not understanding that importance of that relationship definitely made an impact when I had that conversation. And again, it was not a pleasant one, but it was a learning opportunity.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to try to think back, put that new technician hat on, or even like outside of sterile processing, if it's supply chain or if it's other of the less clinical type of roles, and just thinking, hey, this tray has 126 instruments in it. What's the big deal if one of them is missing? And, to your point, it becomes a big deal depending on who's using the tray, what procedure it is, what instrument it is that's missing from that tray. So yeah, you got 125, but it's this one for this stage of the procedure that can't be substituted. There's nothing else in the tray that can be used, and that's the one that's missing. And yeah, to your point, that has a tremendous impact, ripples out. And again, that's going to come up. That's going to be a theme, I think, that we're going to get to again here in a second. But, that new technician perspective, the education piece early on of, this slows you down processing-wise, but let's talk about implications it has for the patients and the customer service piece that you mentioned as well, I think is really, really important. So as a technician, because I think the majority of folks tuning into this session in this conference are going to be the doers out there, the front line, the folks that are encountering all of the missing instruments that may come through their workflow. It has an impact because technicians can only control so much of this missing instrument challenge in terms of availability and organization and replacement. So can you talk through just that mindset, or maybe what you remember before you got into a role that you could impact missing instruments? What did that feel like to be in a tech and then just having these instruments come across your table that aren't there?
Oh, wow. So that definitely was disheartening to me, trying to do the perfect, set of instruments, assemble it at a good amount of time and just be productive at work. And again, missing instrument after missing instrument after missing instrument. I can't imagine how much time I actually spent looking for the stuff and not being able to find it. And so it was very disheartening to know that I couldn't do a great job because I didn't have the tools, or in this case, instruments available to do that. So I can see where a lot of people can become very bitter very quickly with not having the right support and processes in place to help with this.
Yeah, it goes a little bit to, and you kind of described this, but you didn't use this term. It's that high performance tech that really impact the most. It's the ones that come in and they want to do as good a job as they can possibly do. They want to be productive. They want to have high quality, and they want to stay in the flow, in the zone, and you get on that assembly table and you're like, okay, like, here we go. We're going to crank this thing out. And then every tray, it seems like you got something else that's missing, and it's not easy. And if we have time, we'll get into this, that you don't just want to mark it missing without some kind of search. And you also don't just want to substitute willy-nilly without some kind of process. And you're left in this, gray zone of how long do I look? When do I say it's not going to happen? Who do I talk to? Do I talk to anyone? This is slowing me down. Do I do this tray? Do I put this tray back on the shelf and let someone else deal with the problem? All of these things are swirling around, and the newer of a tech you are, the harder that process is to determine. And even experienced techs, who tend to be many of our most productive techs, then you're slowing down an even higher volume of productivity because of these missing instruments. And then your point about the frustration and the that long-term impact to morale is really, really powerful and really dangerous, I think, for this challenge if left unchecked and unaddressed. So that's the technician perspective, and I'm sure many of the other sessions in this conference are going to talk a lot more about that. But for this interview, I want to kind of fast forward us a couple of years, through the frustration, through the conversations that you've had with your OR customers, to your first opportunity to take this bull by the horns, to climb Mount Everest of missing instruments. So what did that role look like, John? How did you get into the role? Maybe let's start there.
So it's interesting. At that point, different hospital. I started there again as a fire lab technician, spent a year as, just a tech. And I learned all the frustrations, from that aspect of it. And then the instrument coordinator role opened up, and I had some very serious interviews, conversations with not only the sterile processing leadership, but with OR leadership and the OR staff to really understand the problems they were having and their frustrations. And they wanted to know a little bit about what I could do to solve that. So definitely getting in front of the customer and having those conversations up front let me know the impact they wanted, and then what I really would have to do to step up and meet those needs.
So at that point, John, you had been in a couple of facilities that had instrument coordinators, so you were able to kind of see that role from the outside looking in. But as you mentioned, these job interviews were the first time that you really had the opportunity to say, yeah, but this is what I would do, and this is how I would approach this challenge. So what did that experience, maybe like in the job interviews, or maybe like some of those early ideas before you actually had to do the role, right? Because it's easy to throw rocks on the outside and say, oh yeah, I would have done it this way. I would have fixed this a long time ago. But, looking back in those early days, what was some of those things that you had already identified as either this is a challenge that has to be fixed regarding missing instruments, or even a vision for the way that you wanted to improve the process?
I think one of the largest challenges in the piece I wanted to tackle was how things were organized in the departments, or the lack of organization. And so I thought it would be easy. Hey, let's put everything in order. We'll keep it neat. We'll buy everything we need. and that will be it, right?
Right.
And,
Easy, man. I mean, duh, right.
yeah. So it definitely was an eye opener when it wasn't quite that smooth, but that's what I was thinking of stepping into that role.
So, I don't think I have said this in this interview yet, but you and I were in this department together. And at that point, I remember you took the instrument coordinator role, and I believe I was a technician at that point. Is that correct? I was just
yes.
Still, yeah, like I was second shift tech. So I was in that tech perspective we were talking about before, with the frustrations and the irritations, coming in, wanting to do a good job, dealing with this Mount Everest. And this is what I'm going to kind of ask you next. The scope of this problem when you started. I remember what the scope of it was at the technician level, as did you, because that's where you started in that role. And then stepping into the instrument coordinator position, what confronted you, right? Like, what was that kind of week one when you finally got your arms around the scope of the problem and these missing instruments? What did that look like?
That looked like a big pile of I don't know what to do next. I remember the SPD director came in and had this 35-page report listing, missing instruments from all the sets.
Wow.
And she put that on my desk, and I let it sit there for 2 weeks without touching it because I did not know where to start.
Wow.
And so after a little courage build up, I finally picked that thing up and started reading through it, trying to understand the scope of what I've just gotten myself into.
So do you remember about how many instruments were missing? I know you said 35 pages of a report, but what did that actually equal?
That's a great question. I wish I had kept that report and all those numbers. I want to say it was close to about 1,000 instruments, give or take.
Okay. Yeah.
But quite a few.
Well, and, the secret to this is, it's another one of those things that you don't really know until you start looking, is you've got the report, and then you've got the reality of all the missing instruments that are actually not on the report for all kinds of reasons related to data and tracking systems and count sheets, etc. And so, yeah, whatever that initial report was still kind of the tip of the iceberg for what the real problem was. Is that right?
Absolutely. That just opened my eyes to what lay beneath. So
that's the report. Talk a little bit about the organizational side of things, because obviously, you're going to walk into this instrument coordinator role. There's a lot of trays missing individual instruments, and that's that kind of 1,000 mark that you just mentioned in that 35 pages worth of stuff. But kind of walk us through that visual representation of the physical challenges related to missing instruments. And I want the audience, when they hear you describe this, look mentally at your own department as John's talking through what he saw, and think, hey, is this describing my department? Is this describing what I see when I look around my department today?
So at that point, at that department, there were bins and bins of random instruments all in the back cabinets. They were loosely put together, maybe by specialty, but if you needed something specific, you had to spend a good amount of time digging through the bins to find the right specialty before you could even start to find something similar to what you were looking for. So finding, rare instruments definitely you could spend a couple hours. Things more common, even like scissors or towel clips, sponge sticks, they may not even be there because they were all in other trays. So there was a big pile of mess that was just in the back that no one wanted to deal with.
And so when you reference that, you're speaking to the unsterile backup instrument inventory. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And what about on the sterile side, pill pack wall of single instruments that's well organized and categorized? What did that look like? Did you have one of those?
So absolutely not.
Okay.
A lot of things that did occur back there is instruments were found randomly in pill packed, and so they would go up to the OR in some bin or some location, and they weren't tracked. They were just stuck somewhere. Maybe someone put them in their locker because that happened a lot back then, and just they were not available, either sterile or unsterile, because someone was hoarding them, hiding them away, and or some people kept things, near the scrub sink and washed it, and at that time called it flashing, but now USS'd it, so they'd have it.
So you mentioned hoarding, and I guess now is as good as time as any to ask about that. What is the cause of hoarding? If you were to look beyond the actual action of, thinking it's a good idea to take an instrument out of normal circulation and storage and put it somewhere else that only you or a certain few people know where it is in the OR, what do you think drives that? What's the reason behind that?
So like I mentioned earlier, now in those initial conversations with the OR, there was a critical instrument they needed at one time and they didn't have it. So I know a lot of scrub techs remember those situations and say, I'm going to hold on to this one for the next time I need it because it may not be in the tray. And then that just isolates it for them and their use, and maybe not the other scrub techs or the other surgeons, OR. So that definitely drives that I'm going to hold on to this for my use. So being a little selfish, I think, but that was born from that need that was left unmet.
Right.
In that one experience.
It's not selfishness, just because they want to be selfish. It's, hey, it's impacted one of my patients, and I'm not going to let that happen again. And I think you're absolutely right. It's the lack of trust in the process and in the sterile processing team, and so they kind of take it into their own hands, quite literally. And that's a great example. Let's kind of maybe think bigger than just hoarding here for this next question, but there's implications for what you're describing. The 35 pages of missing instruments, the physical inventory that's not well defined or organized or complete, the sterile storage inventory that's all over the place, not scanned, no dedicated locations. We got hoarding going on. That has implications for our own processes, our budget, our data. Kind of speak to those early days again about what you were seeing all of these things snowball into as you began this instrument coordination process.
Again, that's your Mount Everest, a very large mountain to tackle. So I would just take a step back and say, understanding what all that meant was a big part of where to start. Why was it missing? How can we organize? What do they need? And I think that was a big piece I learned early on, is just because something's missing, is it actually needed any longer? So trying to answer those questions, have that conversation with the OR, with scrub techs especially, who are the frontline technicians in their world, and understand that need, and really start to hone in on how can we create a process that will allow us to complete these trays consistently and correctly every time. And so that's what I was really trying to understand in the beginning.
Yeah, that question of what do we need, we're going to actually be talking about that in a session in this conference going to happen a little bit later today, talking about tray optimization, and we're going to dive in and have those discussions, but if you're from the outside looking in, kind of how you mentioned when you first took that role, there could be an easy solution, right? You got 1,000 missing instruments. Well, just buy them all, right? Make one big order, and then your missing instrument list is done. But your question about why is this missing, number one, because if we don't know why, buying a whole bunch of new instruments, replacing them is like the definition of, idiocy, right? You're banging your head against the wall, expecting different results. Well, if you just buy more of what's already missing, newsflash is probably going to go missing again. Not a good investment. And that's the budget implication that we were kind of alluding to. But then you got this other piece of, hey, should this even be in the trade to begin with? Is it needed still today? So I want to go into that, a little bit more, because I think that is a big part of an easy misstep in the early stages of trying to get at these missing instruments, to just say, oh, they're missing, so they need to be replaced. How did you work through answering that question? Is this still needed?
So again, talking with the scribe techs, communication, understanding that an instrument was needed at one point at one time during a difficult procedure, but perhaps the surgeon that needed it was no longer at that facility, and so it went missing and not replaced. Just they weren't there. So there again, that went back to, now we need to update count sheets. Let's truly drill down to what we need, and then take steps to get that item in stock and inventory, and make it easier to get in tray than to mark it missing. So open communication, again, very key in this whole process.
So, John, you've mentioned scrub techs. Is there anyone else in the OR that was important, for those conversations around, hey, do you still need this anymore? And also, can I update your count sheets?
Absolutely. I know that's a very daunting conversation to have, but surgeons are the best people to speak to about what they need. And I know there's this air of, oh, they're the doctor, but they're people too, and they're trying to take care of their patients. So just truly understanding what they're asking for, what they need, is a big part of solving this mystery. And then it's easy to even build those relationships and conversations as you go along, so you can just reach out with even a quick text like I do now and say, hey, doc, what do you need? And I get a response, and we go from there.
Yeah, your quote that surgeons are still people is really important. And we did a whole podcast episode on that a couple seasons ago called The Surgeons We Serve, and we talked to 8 different surgeons across that season. And a big takeaway, in addition to, just kind of getting into their mind around things, was just humanizing them. They're just like us, right? They go to school, they learn the job, they have their first day at the hospital, they're brand new. We had an episode, we talked about impact that residents tend to have on missing instruments or broken instruments sometimes, and just the reality around that. So, I think that is, it's a point that we need to continue pushing for sterile processing instrument coordinators, lead techs and supervisors of, yes, it can be daunting. It can be scary sometimes to broach that relationship. It can even be hard. It can be hard even to get access to surgeons, right? They're in the case, but then where do they go? Like, how do I find them? Unless I'm just like in the hallway waiting for them to step out of the room. And I'd be curious, in addition to the scrub techs, who else did you partnership, or what other relationships did you build to get access, to the surgeons or to the right folks on that team to make those decisions?
The 2-step process there would be the coordinators for the OR, the service line leads. Okay. They have various titles, but then right. I also worked with the OR management team as well, because we worked both surgeons individually, and then we started working on building services up as well. So understanding what they would need beforehand and starting to solve some of those future issues was a big component of this down the line.
Well, so let's go back to your list. And I'm assuming that a lot of folks are going to want to get done with this session, or maybe even right now, they may be multitasking. This is going on in the background, and they're turned over to their tracking system saying, I probably have a list like that. Let me try to pull that and take a look and see how many pages mine is. And, they're asking, okay, which one of these maybe aren't even needed anymore, but where else would you say would be a good place or a smart place to start? Like if you were going to organize priority, what would you tell folks, or what did you do maybe in your experience to say, okay, out of all these 1,000 instruments, yeah, but are they all equal in their priority?
So I took this in a two-step process. I looked at what was missing and noticed a lot of common trends, like needle holders, for example. There were a lot of variations of what I would call the basic needle holder. So standardizing the instrument patterns was a big piece. Instead of just buying one type of particular vendor versus another one that just had to be in one set, but not anything else, definitely limited what we could have available. So creating that piece in that helped eliminate all the variations. And then secondly, looking at the other big piece I remember in this particular hospital was implants and replacements, implants, travel screws, things of that nature, and understanding why no one followed through with that and solving those issues. Basically, we need to have stock on hand, in trauma situations. So that was another organizational piece, and looking at updating that so we would have the inventory every time to fill those trays. And then another piece with that would be like the ortho spine trays. I remember it was also a big mess just because the stock had never been replenished.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned in one part of that answer the topic of standardizing, and I thought it was really helpful what you said. There's one approach to standardization that just says, okay, we're going to use the same vendor. And that's great, right? Because that does reduce complexity in your trays. Like, it's getting at all the different variations that you mentioned. It even helps to standardize nomenclature, which we could do a whole episode around, and the impact that has on missing instruments too. And in fact, we could do a whole episode on standardization probably as well, I guess, while we're thinking about it. But you also mentioned that, standardization, good standardization of the kind that you're talking about, that's going to reduce the number of missing instruments, it's going to increase efficiency, it's going to ensure that, surgeons get what they need, not necessarily always what they prefer, or, what they have had in other hospitals. Now that they come to this hospital and they want the same thing kind of thing, but they get what they need. And, that piece is reducing the variations to the, not the lowest common denominator, but the fewest variations possible that do not sacrifice clinical efficiency and effectiveness, right? They're not going to compromise the quality of care, but it's not everybody gets their own variation of the widget. And so we have 100 variations of needle holders in sterile processing now to keep track of. And then no wonder we end up with substitutions that are not what that one specific one is. So can you speak to that topic a little bit more? Because that's going to probably be a new one, for some folks that are just new to this this missing instrument conversation, and specifically, new to what it really could mean or maybe should mean when you take that approach of standardization beyond just one vendor or, two vendors.
Absolutely. So first of all, instruments vary slightly, and I know every manufacturer out there has roughly the same measurements. They can vary up to a quarter to half inch, but the end uses are the same. So understanding that and realizing you can't buy instruments for one vendor today to replace everything that you have.
Mm-hmm. That's the budget
place
piece.
To start. Yeah, that's the budget piece. But understanding that they're all very similar is an important step. And then you take your common instrument patterns, is what I would say, the scissors, Mayo Straights, or the Metz and Bombs, even the Edson Lateith or the Ferris-Smiths, and start to group them together. And yes, they might vary in a quarter of an inch, or maybe the teeth are a little bit longer in one and not the other. But again, having those conversations, the OR saying, this is what we have. Is this acceptable? Can we start grouping these together and putting them in the sets? And that's the important piece, I think. And then updating your count sheets, because if you have 10 different types of an instrument in your backup system, you need to make sure they're all listed or equivalents are listed in your tracking system. So as that brand new tech, you pick up a needle holder. Is this one acceptable as a 6-inch Mayo? Hager, yes, it is. Great, I can use it. It might be 5 3/4 long, but it's still good to put in this tray.
Yeah, so I really appreciate you brought up the question part of that, because sometimes just asking the question of the scrub tech or of the surgeon or of the instrument coordinator, if you have your information laid out, like you said, it's like, I know you got, 5 inches in here. Would you be okay if we did 6-inch? Would that be okay? Because we're doing 6-inch, for all these other service lines, for all these other trays. This is the one-off exception just for this service line. Y'all got 5 inches, 5.5. And you'd be shocked at how many people say, yeah, that's fine. I don't really care about the 5-inch thing. 1 inch is not going to make a lot of difference in the way that we use it. Now, there are times where they come back and be like, absolutely not. You can change anything else about that tray, but you're not going to change the length of those needle holders, and that's okay. Now But until you ask that question, like you said, you're operating under assumptions that these trays and these count sheets, like you alluded to, that they just came down from Mount Sinai on a silver platter and they can never be changed. And that's not how these trays come to life. That's not how these count sheets are written. And many, many times through the course of that process, just asking those standardization questions can get you so much reduction in variation, which then leads to a question that I'm going to ask you next on the storage piece, but it reduces the complexity of your backup storage and your part numbers that you're ordering. I mean, so many implications, and it all just came back to, hey, do you really need this, or could you use this? And this is why I'm asking. All right. So sterile storage, John, or not sterile storage, I'm sorry, unsterile storage, backup inventory. You've already thrown out, hey, we got count sheets that we have to update. We've got conversations we have to have with the clinical side. We've got standardization, internal standardization has to happen with grouping these like instruments together that would be acceptable. And then you got this physical backup question on how to manage this. How did you approach it? And just, where do you start? Do you got to get all the data clean first and then you do backup? Can you do these concurrently? Where did you begin and what did you learn along the way for what's the best way to work through it?
So, not everything happens in a single line. So definitely I worked on this while I was having conversations with various folks to understand what they need. So I started loosely grouping the backup and instrumentation together. So let's put all the scissors in one area, all forceps in one area, retractors this other one. And then I took several sweeps, as I called it, through the backup instruments and continue to separate the instrument pattern. So every little step was continuing to refine it, until we got to the point where we had bins for each type of instrument. When I say that, we'd have a 6-inch needle holder, an 8-inch needle holder. We would have an acid with teeth bin. So they were all in a singular bin. And then those bins were given location coordinates, if you will. And that allowed me to not only monitor the bins to see what was in stock, what I need to order, but those location coordinates were placed on count sheets. So as a frontline technician was doing a set and they were missing their towel clips, it said, hey, go to the backup wall at this spot, you'll find them. And so that allowed them to find the instruments they needed easier. And if they had extra instruments in their set, I had an extras bin that they could dump all their stuff into. And then I could go back and sort it all out to maintain this backup inventory and keep it from getting to be an overwhelming pile of mess again. So it took a lot of steps to get that organized.
So it took a lot of steps. So how much time are we talking about? Average, an average facility size. I want to say that hospital was around 300, maybe 350 beds, and you're starting from zero. Let's say, you just had a big mountain ahead of you. Are we talking about it took a couple of weeks to get all this stuff figured out, John, or what's reasonable timeline?
So it took a couple of weeks to figure out that it was not going to take a couple of weeks to figure this out. I really felt that the first year gave me a good grasp on it, and that was being dedicated, making sure that I was staying on top of it. But a year and a half in, definitely had the right direction going. We had everything getting tuned to where I wanted to be. And again, about a 2-year mark where I had everything labeled, I had everything updated in the tracking system. I even took pictures of every instrument that we had at that facility and didn't use stock photos because they all varied a little bit. And just, built that relationship with the OR leadership, management, surgeons, which allowed me to then, at that point, maintain what we had built.
So we've talked a little bit, and you just alluded to you were able to build that buy-in on the OR side, but we haven't talked yet about how you built buy-in on the sterile processing tech side of things. You alluded to it just a little bit on the on the backup storage space when you said we got to keep this organized through those extra bins so that it doesn't go backward. And it just brings up an important point. You can do all the work on the standardization, all the work on the data and the count sheets. You can do all the work on getting a really great backup, bin system, pegboard system created. And then you got techs like me who are clocking in and assembling trays. How did you get our buy-in, John, to see the vision and the impact and, the long term, right? Because as you said, this wasn't a 3-week thing. It's like, hey, I'm going to fix your world. It's going to be done. There's going to be like some trays that are done, some that are not. There's going to be some backup instruments that are done. There's going to be some that are not. There's going to be some count sheets that are updated, some that are not. How'd you communicate? What was the process like? What'd you learn maybe through that process that you could share?
Again, communication is key to this. And getting people to trust you was definitely another challenge I had because everyone had heard that we were going to fix the issues before and no one had. So the key point was to make it easier to find something than to just mark it missing. Again, it took time to get to that point. But having an open door policy and talking with frontline techs, understanding what their pain points were and what we could do to solve it was a big piece of this. And then showing up every day, letting them know I was working on it, getting their input, getting, their needs brought out to not only myself, but to SPD management, OR leadership was an important piece to make sure they were heard. And then just working with them to solve these issues. And yes, there were some people that definitely resisted it at first. They didn't believe that could happen, but slowly along the way, they started, cheering us on to make sure that we made their job easier in the long run. Because some people had saw the mess, they had saw the just chaos that was there, and just realized slowly, surely it was getting better to the point where they were championing this down the line and making sure all the other new people were helping us maintain what had been built.
Yeah, just this morning I saw a post on LinkedIn that was talking about the dangers of institutional knowledge in healthcare. And this is going back to the beginning of that Mount Everest story that we've been talking about. But I remember even as chaotic as the backup inventory was back then, a lot of the old timers could still, within reason, get to some of the various categories of instruments. They knew where some of the scissors were, even if the bins weren't labeled, or maybe they were labeled with something else. They still knew, but yeah, that's where we put the scissors. But when new technicians came on, or technicians or travelers from outside, none of that institutional knowledge was transferred or transferable. And the same with the count sheets. And we see this all the time across the country, is there'll be count sheets that a majority of the old timers know, oh yeah, we don't even really use that count sheet. We know what's supposed to be in the tray. We know Dr. So-and-so likes this, or Dr. So-and-so does not like this. And so we just make those edits, even though it's not reflected on the count sheet. But man, John, like, that is setting up, especially new technicians, but quite frankly, every member of the team, up for disaster, because it's not transparent in what it is that you're supposed to do. So that piece of the puzzle, I'm assuming, was also a potential pushback, because now you're jacking with something that people are already used to. It's a process they already know. And then here comes John one weekend coming in here and updating storage. And they're like, now I can't find anything, John.
Yes. Again, that's where updating count sheets is also a very important part of this. So every step-by-step should be documented, and everything should be updated as you go. And getting their input. Where should this be? How should this be listed? How can we make sure we're capturing this knowledge and sharing it with someone? Because that new tech coming in, feeling overwhelmed and learning everything that facility does, and then not knowing that Dr. So-and-so's instrument is in this whole shoulder retractor bin over here, even though he's a plastics guy, that doesn't help them. So again, conversations, very key in this whole process, I think. And then, making sure the information you have captured in your count sheets, your tracking system, is reflecting what's going on. And definitely they have to be able to handle some touchy conversations. Some people don't like to share their info, or some people want to be the good guys and saviors of the day, pull something out of thin air. Getting them to understand it's not about us, it's about patient care is the ultimate piece there in my mind. And that, bridges that gap between the OR and SPD.
So you mentioned, John, at the role or the vision that you had was to make it easier to find and replace an instrument than it was to just mark the instrument missing. And I think, that's a really helpful perspective for anybody, if it's instrument coordinator, if it's a lead tech that's managing this, if it's, God forbid, the manager that has to manage all this process, whatever it is, coming into this, just knowing that, that's a piece of this puzzle. Now, it's one piece, but it's not the only piece. Obviously, we're talking about replacing instruments that are missing, but we're not necessarily yet addressing how and why these instruments go missing in the first place. So I'm curious, in this big conversation and journey that you had through this process, what did you learn about the causes of instrument disappearance and how to address those constructively and collaboratively as an instrument coordinator?
So again, understanding why things are missing, I think, is a key point, like you said, and looking at what's missing. And one of the things I found is sometimes rooms were opening up 3 sets of instruments, pulling an instrument out of one tray and another one out of another tray, and they thought them all in this 4th tray that they didn't even pull anything out of, but it was there because it's on their table, right? And so understanding the usage again, and then either streamlining the sets or creating a set with all the instruments they need, so they not only open one tray, they only have one tray to throw everything back in, would be a good place to start as well.
Yeah, that idea, I don't think we've said it on this interview, but instrument migration is kind of what you described, where you got multiple trays and the instruments are just traveling between the trays, no boundaries, no passports. They just go wherever they're put. and then they come through decontam, and sometimes they stay together. I've seen facilities that are really intentional about keeping their trays together through that process, not only for this missing instrument piece, but that's part of it, in order so that when they come through on the clean side, if you've got tray A that's missing, 6 instruments, you're like, where on earth could 6 of these instruments be? Like, I understand there's a tail clamp or there's an Atson forcep in the trash, but come on now, like all the Kellys as well. And then, as your story alluded to, you get to tray B or C, and you're like, oh, that's where it is. These were open together. These were used together. Of course, that's where the instruments landed. But if your facility doesn't have that kind of batching process, which, there's a downside to that too. That's not necessarily the most efficient way to process or to clean or to send it through the workflow. But if it doesn't have that, then sometimes you're sitting around there having to figure out kind of mentally which tray would this have been used for, what kind of case. And, many times these instruments are coming in or being added in as pill packs, standalone pill packs that were added. And so you've got extras that, are these extras that go in another tray? And so they're actually missing the instruments from another tray? Or are these just extras that now can be pill packed and don't have to be held into some kind of, purgatory right now? And so it's such a complicated cause, as you mentioned, such a complicated, potential cause. And then obviously, because the causes are complicated, there's complicated solutions. So going back in time here, John, I do want to ask, looking back in your journey to tackling all things missing instruments, is there anything that you did that maybe you wouldn't do the same way if you could live that over? Maybe a lesson or two that you've learned.
Oh, but experience is the best teacher, right? Honestly, the hardest part about that, I think, in the beginning was trying to figure it all out on my own and not starting those conversations to begin with. And I would definitely sit down with everyone in the beginning, the frontline technicians, the leadership, the scrub techs, the docs, and start that conversation sooner, because it took me a while to get there. And then, reaching out, figuring out what other people did too to help address this would be a key piece in this, because I invented the wheel and went forward, and maybe some other, folks could have helped me with that process too. Definitely, networking was the big thing in my time back then, but that would have helped tremendously.
So, John, you mentioned, this was kind of an early stage process that we spent the majority of our time talking about today. But then there's a maintenance stage of, okay, now you got one page of missing instruments. And these are instruments that went missing yesterday, potentially. And maybe instead of 1,000, there's, anywhere from 5 to 10. What's different about how you approached that challenge, versus the challenge that we've spent the majority of our time talking about? Is there different strategies or approaches to those smaller lists of just maintaining the status quo of primarily complete trays?
So I haven't mentioned this at this point, but being able to speak to what was missing, especially when we got down to that 10 instruments or less time frame in that department, but understanding that those were singular instruments that we never really had backups for, or that they were broken, was a key piece in that. So knowing what was in the repair bin, knowing what was offsite getting repaired, knowing that it would be returning within a few weeks, definitely impacted that. So I could speak to that to everyone, saying this is missing today. It should be back in the tray 2 weeks from today. Definitely lit itself to not the credibility just me, but to our department, and that I could account for everything. So at that point too, understanding if there's a new surgeon coming in or if there's a new need, we need to revise our backup wall a little bit add some new instruments, maybe take some stuff away that's no longer being used to make room for that. It would just be part of the maintaining process. And then staying on top of the tracking system is a huge piece of that, because if you've never dealt with that, tracking systems can get messed up quite easily, and that makes all the difference when you're processing sets, and it can take a long time to recover from that. So keeping everything neat and tight was a big component of just keeping the instruments in the sets and not who knows where.
Yeah, John, we didn't get a lot of time to go into some of these other topics, but for the remaining minutes, we got about 5 minutes left. I want to kind of spitball or fastball a few of these. What impact did tray organization have? Custom tray organization, tray layout, maybe would be a better way to say. What impact did that have, or does that have on this missing instrument piece in your mind?
I think it makes it easier to assemble sets. So everything's in the same similar pattern or layout. Makes it easier for the technicians to know what's coming next, to know how to organize, how to lay out the tray, and know what they're looking for as they're laying the tray out before they assemble it. And then putting it together makes it a lot quicker. So they're not going back and forth across the count sheet, to a ring handle force up to pick up to a retractor. It's all laid out step by step. Definitely makes that process easier, and it makes it easier to identify what is and is not in the tray at that moment. And then even tying sets together as part A's or part B's or ones or two or whatever people would label them, lets them know they should be processed together, because they're probably, as you said, have instrument migration going on between the two.
Right. What type of collaboration did your role as instrument coordinator have with the role of the sterile processing liaison or the SPD OR liaison? How did that impact your ability to do your job and to tackle many of the things that we've talked about on this interview?
So the OR liaison was definitely the face of SPD at the time, and they would walk into those heated conversations in the OR, which would allow frustrations to be expressed before I was brought in, which I was always thankful of. Let the people get the steam off their chest, and let's have a serious conversation about what they need. But they definitely broke the ground. They were the first ones in, found out the problem, and then reported, this is the issue we found. And then that gave me time to think through solutions and go present it to both the surgeon, OR leadership, and SPD leadership. So we definitely worked hand in hand to solve all these issues before they became major explosions.
All right. So the final piece I'll ask you is it's the piece on team buy-in to this mission, because if anything has been evident in this interview, even though you're a man on a mission and it takes the spark to get the fire going, it took the team, including the OR and the surgeon and the coordinators and the scrub techs and sterile processing and OR liaison and your managers and your directors. Like, it took everybody to do this. So what role did, celebration play in the stages of accomplishment, getting to the peak of the mountain, or, getting them the mountain peak, I guess, all the way down to the bottom to where you were 10 instruments instead of 1,000. What role did that play?
It's always easier to look at failures, I think, than successes. And that was one thing I wish we had done maybe a little bit differently too, is to set those milestones, those markers, and to really acknowledge it. Now, I know at one time we did lots of SPD newsletters to highlight what SPD was doing well. And that also highlighted the number of missing instruments, and it tracked, how they diminished over time. And it would have been better, I think, to have done more of that with the OR itself. I did contribute multiple times to OR huddles and spoke about due processes and what was going on, but maybe doing that more in a routine would have been a little more helpful. But definitely celebrating those wins is a big piece. I think about my current experience. A couple of years ago, I had a scrub tech who would always say, "You're going to let me down, and I'm going to let you know when you do." And then 6 months went by, 12 months went by. He says, "You haven't let me down yet." And then nowadays is like, "Man, you always come through." And to me, I always look at that took a couple of years to get to it, but just again, having that joy and that almost thumbs up wave from scrub techs, from surgeons, from everyone around is uplifting to me.
Yeah, I think the moral of this story, John, is it's possible, right? Change is possible no matter how big this missing instrument challenge is, no matter how many implications, no matter how many surgeries have been impacted already. It is possible in every facility under the sun. If you did it, if we did it in that facility at that time, anybody can do it. But hopefully the big takeaway out of this is it's not that you can do it without any strategy or without any thought or without a lot of hard work or without years of commitment. It's not an easy fix. And so, John, I really appreciate you sharing your story and your passion and your successes with us today on this session.
Thank you, Hake. I appreciate being here. It's been a pleasure.
All right. And we'll turn it back over to our host.